Good morning, everyone. My name is Nevin Cohen, and I'm the director of the Cuny Urban Food Policy Institute. And I want to welcome you today to our forum on using public food procurement to advance racial equity, a topic that is really critical, really timely, and multidimensional. So I hope we have a chance to think through, strategies and practices that can really help us advance racial equity as we think about public procurement. The Cuny Urban Food Policy Institute engages in research, education, and action for just, healthy, and resilient urban food systems. We all work across different disciplines and with different sectors to address issues like poverty, racism, and inequality, the drivers of food insecurity, malnourishment, and health disparities. And we welcome you to be involved with our work as collaborators, as colleagues. If you aren't a subscriber to our newsletter, please sign up. You can go to our website, cunyurbanfoodpolicy.org, and we've actually just relaunched the website, so check back to learn about future forums as well. For the past week, I've been actually in Europe meeting with a number of European urban food policy leaders from cities as diverse as Tirana, Albania, to Birmingham, England, to Rome, and every single person who works on food policy recognizes that the public plate, municipal procurement of food and food-related services, is really an important lever for cities to influence the regional food sheds that surround them and the people who depend on public meals, especially for most cities, school-aged children, because that's typically the canteens that serve the most number of people in the city and the most vulnerable populations. Much of the effect around changing food procurement has been on things like supporting food producers and buying healthy, sustainably produced food. An issue that has really not been addressed sufficiently is the one we're going to tackle today, how procurement can also support racial equity. And so we want to talk about some of the different policy options and implementation strategies, some success stories and potential shortcomings of existing solutions to addressing racial disparity through public food procurement. And today's moderator, I'm going to turn this over to in a second, is Mwbe Certification, who's the director of the New York Good Food Purchasing Program campaign at Advocates, and she's been working tirelessly for several years on this issue. I can't think of a better person to help us think through these issues today. So I'd like to turn it over to you, Mwbe, and Mwbe will introduce the panelists as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nevin, for the introduction and for, of course, setting the stage for what I know will be a thought-provoking discussion today. As Nevin mentioned, my name is Mwbe Certification, and I'm the director of the New York Good Food Purchasing Program campaign here at Community Food Advocates. Community Food Advocates is an organization that works at the intersection of advocating for high-impact food policy and strategic coalition building. When we talk about leveraging the public plate or the power of the public plate, we are saying that because large public institutions like our schools, hospitals, carceral settings, senior centers, homeless shelters, etc., spend significant amounts of money on food, we know that they can influence food-related companies from producers and processors to aggregators and distributors to adhere to practices in line with the values and the priorities of both the institutions and the communities that they serve. Our nation's food system, we undoubtedly know, has been rooted and built off of exploitation and systemic oppression that dates back to the inception of this country. But what if we use our public dollars to create paradigm shifts in our food system that prioritize and that uplift racial equity and racial justice across our local, regional, and national food systems. The Good Food Purchasing Program is just one tool to do that. This program transforms the way that public institutions purchase food by creating a transparent and equitable food system built on 5 core values. That's local economies, nutrition, valued workforce or labor, animal welfare, and environmental sustainability. The question that we seek to answer, or one of the plethora of questions that we seek to answer in using this program, is how can we create more opportunities and pathways for food businesses that uphold these values? Across the country, approximately 60 institutions have implemented, across 24 cities, have implemented the Good Food Purchasing Program. There are about 11 active coalitions, including an active coalition both here in New York City and New York State that we're spearheading here at Community Food Advocates. These institutions represent a combined total of over $1 billion of food purchased from vendors that uphold the 5 values that I mentioned. And for context, here in New York City alone, since we are here at Cuny, we have 11 public agencies that have committed to implementing the Good Food Purchasing Program, a number of which are actively assessing their food procurement dollars. Across those 11 agencies, we spend about $500 million on food. New York City is committed to the Good Food Purchasing Program. Mayor Adams actually reminded us yesterday at the White House Conference on Hunger, Nutrition, and Health, actually reminded the country that New York City most recently committed to adopting and signing an Executive Order 8 earlier this year that committed the city to the Good Food Purchasing Program. In both the past and present, I've worked in varying capacities with the panelists that you'll be hearing from today. They are thought leaders and they're experts in the question of how we leverage the power of the public plate. You'll have a moment at the end of this panel to ask questions, so feel free to jot your questions down, and you'll have a moment to lift them up for us to ask those questions of these panelists. So I'll get to these panelists we'll get to these panelists in just a moment, but to introduce them very quickly, we'll be hearing from Dakari Howard, who is the Equitable Supply Chain Development Specialist at the Chicago Food Policy Action Council. We'll then be hearing from Fatai Shea, who's the Director of Food Procurement at the Department of Citywide Administrative Services here in New York City at the Office of Citywide Procurement. We'll also then be hearing from Rachel Terry, who's the National Partnerships Director at the Common Market. So Dakari, shall I pass it over to you?
Yes, please. Thank you. And also, can we get our slides up? Full screen. Actually, I might just share it from my. All right. Give me 1 second.
Dakari, the slides are live now. Let me know if you can see them. Thank you.
Perfect, thank you. Hey, good morning, everybody. Again, I'm Dakari Howard. I serve as the Equitable Supply Chain Development Specialist with the Chicago Food Policy Action Council. And during this slide, I guess we'll just be showcasing some of the work that we've been able to do through Good Food Purchasing and some of the other activities within CFPAC's frame of work of developing a more equitable and sustainable food system. Next slide, please. So about CFPAC, essentially we serve as a conduit between a series of stakeholders and ways that we could use our own perspectives and disciplines to engage within the larger Metro Chicago food shed. The Chicago Food Policy Action Council co-develops, facilitates, and advocates to support the implementation of policies to manifest food justice and sovereignty across Chicago region. This is our staff, along with a couple of Emerson Fellows. We have Enrique, that's myself. We have Aaliyah Fard, Lauren, Justin Prevost, Roger Cooley, who's our Executive Director, Marley Wilson, who's on this call right now, is the Good Food Purchasing Manager, and Steph Font, who's our Community Network Weaver. Next slide, please. I'll actually pass this slide over to Marley to explain a little bit more about our work and how it touches on a series of essential points that we use to develop a more equitable food system.
Good morning, everyone. So again, I'm Marley Wilson. I'm the Good Food Purchasing Project Manager with the Chicago Food Policy Action Council. And we just wanted to ground this presentation in the broader work that CivPAC, our loving acronym for the Chicago Food Policy Action Council, engages in. So we convene a very diverse group of community members around our Chicago Food Justice Summit and ongoing Rhizome network. And this includes local growers, food businesses, food chain workers, activists, community members, public servants, policymakers, and many, many others. And we prioritize these conversations around environmental justice, community health and food access, community wealth and resource access, and labor rights in our work to build food justice and sovereignty. So through all of these focus areas, we work to address racial and social equity and acknowledgement, especially of Chicago's historic and current racist systems and policies that have led to extreme income inequality, food apartheid, public health disparity, and segregation along lines of race and class in our city and of course across the country. So you can go to the next slide. So we'll be focusing this presentation on, and Dakari will be talking more extensively about the Metro Chicago Good Food Purchasing Initiative, but CivPAC facilitates a lot of other initiatives like the Productive Landscapes Task Force, which focuses on how local growers can access publicly owned lands, and the Midwest Consortium on Equity, Research, and Food Justice, or MCERF for short, the J is silent, which brings academic researchers together from across the city to collaborate on their support of local food justice advocates who are looking to measure the impact of their work. And we're definitely involved in a lot of other exciting work that's not represented in this chart, but we just wanted to give you all kind of a sense of how we currently structure our work and prioritize our time and activities. And I will turn it back over to Dakari to get into GFPI.
Thanks, Marley. So you can see we love acronyms. So just to, I guess, break it down and define GFPP, Good Food Purchasing Policy or Program. And then GFPI, the Good Food Purchasing Initiative. And so essentially the mission behind that is that we work to ensure that places feeding our communities purchase food that advances the good food system for all. And then the good food is accessible, equitable, and racially just, healthy, fair, local, humane, and sustainable. And I guess so specifically, next slide, please. Our vision within that, we envision our food system where our community institutions support and contribute to building the collective power of those structurally excluded from control over food production and access to imagine, build, and tend to a liberatory food shed. And so when we say structurally excluded, more particularly, we're naming meal recipients, food workers, Black, Indigenous, Latinx, people of color, BIPOC, otherwise known, producers, suppliers, growers, activists for animal welfare and environmental justice, communities within targeted disinvestment historically and currently. And when we talk to the liberatory food shed, that's a reasonable food ecosystem free from all social and economic oppression rooted in accountability, reconciliation, and healing. Next slide, please. So who's doing the work within that? So it's a constellation of people and places committed to the vision, values, and mission of GFPI, including, I'm not naming all of them, but it's a series of stakeholders between food chain workers, food growers and farmers, elected officials, food educators, which is like really important, I think, to really name that food literacy piece, to bring all the importance in. Food buyers for local community food access sites, public service workers, nonprofit food policy, public health, and economic development staff. Next slide, please. And so our coordinators include, we work very closely with the Cook County Department of Public Health, the Chicago Department of Public Health, and the City of Chicago's Food Equity Council. The doula part, the Alliance for Health Equity, Roosevelt University, and Policy Research Collaborative to coordinate these GFPI activities. Next slide, please. And so our GFPI key partners, we also collaborate with a large number of partner organizations who are engaged in advancing food justice and sovereignty across Chicago, and are informing our events and priorities through different events, working groups, and task force. Next slide. So the GFPI strategic levers. So we have this this Venn diagram of GFPI implementation, good food culture, and equity and supply chain development. And that's ultimately our GFPI ecosystem. And one of our key priorities over the next 3 years is to further develop a clear, transparent, and accountable leadership structure for GFPI that centers decision-making by those structurally excluded from the food system. A core strategy for us is also continuing to leverage the good food purchasing policy, which was adopted by the city of Chicago in 2017 and Cook County in 2018. And CFPAC provides a direct technical support to the city and county on GFPI, but GFPI partners are also working to identify how we could further change procurement policy and procedure to better align with our mission and values. And so over the next 3 years, we're also aiming to leverage the good food or the GFPP shift to overall culture and around community food access sites so that they are more responsive and accountable to all community members, consumers, food producers, and we are working to open up a space for that transformation and cafeterias to work towards community learning spaces where food is a celebration of culture and the people in the land. Next slide, please. And so, yeah, where we've been, I briefly touched on it. 2018 is when the policy adoption took place from both city and county. And in 2019, that's when we began our development of the theory of change, which led to the Good Food Person Initiative. It's like the policy is there, but what are the steps that we need to take to build up some infrastructures to make that more of a feasible possibility? And from that conversation in 2019, we've identified some key strategies: GFPP implementation, equitable supply chain development, and normalizing a culture of good food purchasing. And again, the leadership who's been involved in that process has been Chicago Department of Public Health, Cook County Department of Public Health, and Chicago Food Policy Action Council. Next slide, please. So our 3-year goal, equitable supply chain development. We want to be able to catalyze new investment in BIPOC food workers, producers, and suppliers to increase participation in institutional supply chains and enhance economic stability and prosperity. Some updates from that in the next slide are leveraging GFPP to build racially equitable and resiliency across the food supply chain through relationship building, training, resources, and research. One of the biggest things that we've been able to utilize is the buyer supplier internally is the buyer supplier network and mixer and vendor fairs. That's something that we kicked off last December. And it's essentially a space where we convene all stakeholders, or we attempt to convene all stakeholders from public procurement, the food distributors, food workers, emerging restaurants, farmers, consumers, day-to-day consumers, food educators, policy advocates, et cetera, to come to a space and just openly and candidly be able to share like what is the experience that we have within this food system. And then honing in and focusing in on some of those conversations to say, what are the needs and the offers within this space? So whether it's direct, I'm a farmer and I need to, begin on some institutional wholesale opportunities, that might be an opportunity, but also we understand that we're working within small to mid-sized farmers within urban agriculture here in Chicago. And the scale and the volume, they just don't match at times. So farmers are also able to connect with one another to say, hey, like, how about we do some kind of informal cooperative models to be able to like supplement for some of the demand that we've been asked to fill some of these institutional requirements. Also speaking to what it takes to get those certifications in plain language, who to talk to specifically. So these are the conversations where we could, one, like begin that relationship building, human-centered, but then also this is also contributing to the broader food shed outside of food procurement as well. Like, how do we just develop a more equitable food system regardless? So some workshops also on institutional markets, minority women business on enterprise certification, food safety and business planning, food health feasibility studies that's been led by Wesleyan Ashton of Illinois Institute of Technology, the Guide for Growers and Food Businesses, which really highlights One, what GFPP is, and that is the tool that's being shaped by community. So we invite folks to be able to come into these spaces and also just share like, hey, this is something I heard you say last time, but this doesn't necessarily fit what our models are. So we have the opportunity to just adjust for that and figure out what infrastructure needs to be built to kind of support in areas that's lacking. And also just highlighting one, like some of the certifications that are important for farmers, some challenges and opportunities, some business development workshops, resources that people could go out and utilize. And it's all a living document that we have on our CIFPAC website. And then exploring procurement opportunities. Ooh, one more. Exploring procurement opportunities and tools to build a small, to support smaller local BIPOC owned farms and food businesses. Next slide. And so these are some photos from the buyer supplier mixers that we've had from December and in June. And so the June mixer, as I mentioned before, it was a wide array of stakeholders, and it was some beautiful conversations being had just about ways that we could further connect and build up our food system in our own individual ways, and where we all can support each other and know who's in the room, just to like hear where can we fill up some of those gaps. What we also learned during that December buyer supplier mixer was that some smaller emerging food businesses and farms, they may not be ready to scale for some of the demand that institutional markets have. However, chefs and restaurateurs who were present, they were, and they were interested in connecting with local farmers. And so the June buyer supplier mixer was more so focused to concessions, restaurants, chefs, where we could just figure out like, you know, who are we identifying right now? Do they want to support local food businesses and farms? How do we incorporate some seasonality into their menu planning, et cetera? So just like a more nuanced version of those conversations. And in a couple of weeks, we'll be having our October buyer supplier vendor fair, where we'll be able to introduce some vendors to, or the Good Food Vendor Fair, which we'll be able to introduce some vendors to some institutional procurement folks on October 12th. So if anybody's in the Chicago area around that time, feel free to come through. Next slide, please. And again, this is the guide for growers and food businesses. And again, I'll just name what the chapters are. It's the GFPP overview, institutions that have already adopted GFPP, some business planning and development resources, current requirements for institutional markets, which outline the certifications and scaling opportunities, talking about logistics, challenges and opportunities, and then helpful resources are also included. One thing that you'll also see like throughout this presentation, and especially on the cover of like this guide right here, is some artwork that we've been able to use a local graphic designer, Rachel Hoffman, to develop some of these images. And they're all real people. And Rachel just used a lot of mixed media to one, like just capture like the silhouette, but also like real, if you look closely on our website, this is actual like produce that serves as like the color schemes and adding texture to like the people. So we thought that was cool. I wanted to lift that up. I'll go to the next slide. And so the GFPI Community Fund, right? So planning to launch the Community Fund in January 2023 with at least $375,000 available per year. The fund will be supported, or the fund will support social enterprises growing and preparing GFPP aligned food and community food access. Just recently we launched the Suburban Cook County Micro Grant in 2022 to pilot concept. We awarded 6 projects or 6 farms and food businesses, which was really exciting. That was really like a pilot for like what this process actually looks like. Who do we convene to do the evaluation and make that decision-making process happen? And this is also going to be prioritizing BIPOC-owned and controlled projects, work with cooperatives and community-rooted efforts. Building community fund committee to develop and develop the fund and then review the applications. Next slide. And I just give thanks for the opportunity to be invited into this space and kind of communicate some of the work that we've been doing and some of the solutions I think are useful that we could, you know, kind of adopt and share and do some knowledge sharing within this space. Included, I have enclosed one, like my contact information, Marley's contact information. So if anybody has any follow-up questions, we have a Q&A today, but down the line, just to stay connected. We have our emails associated with this as well. So I hope to stay connected with this group. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dakari and Marley too. You lifted up how values-based food procurement exists within your local and regional food system, in your ecosystem in Chicago and the surrounding Cook County. And I feel like your remarks also just illuminated how multidimensional this work has to be in order for us to create the paradigm shifts necessary to meaningfully infuse racial equity in our food system. So we're going to get back to a lot of what you both mentioned. So everyone stay tuned. But for right now, we'll transition to Fatai Shea, again, Director of Food Procurement at the Department of Citywide Administrative Services here in New York City at the Office of Citywide Procurement, or OCP. Fatai, I'll pass it over to you.
Great, thank you very much. And that was a really interesting presentation. I'm always interested in hearing what other cities are doing. So it was really great to hear some of the similar, but a little bit different efforts in a different city. But I think there's always important lessons to learn from each other. And it's good that, we're talking to each other and learning about it. So yeah, I mean, procurement, I think a good way, for the audience to kind of get a handle on what we do here, as a city government employee doing procurement work is kind of like provide a lay of the land of how procurement works, because oftentimes, like people don't really understand how, the procurement functions in the city environment. So, I'll just talk a little bit broadly about, like how procurement works generally, then I'll go into the food aspect and then comment on the policy tools that we have to advance some of these things. But yeah, I think procurement is interesting because it's really where the policy meets practice. And oftentimes when you translate policy into practice, there's always things that come up that when you try to operationalize these efforts, it gets really tricky. So generally procurement, what is procurement? Procurement is basically we have to procure goods and services on behalf of the city. And the most important thing is we are spending taxpayer dollars. So there are a whole set of rules and regulations that govern how public procurement works. I'm sure, for the city of Chicago, it's similar. They have rules and regulations that govern how procurement functions, because we need to be transparent, accountable, and we have to be able to justify the things that we buy with taxpayers' dollars. So the rules that are in place are there to, make sure that we're not, buying things that, that we're not supposed to. But before I begin to say a little bit more about that, I just want to say that in the city of New York, the procurement that I'm talking about is not school foods, because schools it's a separate entity, and it's not health and hospitals, because hospitals is also an entity. But what I'm talking about is for mayoral agencies, so all the agencies that falls under the jurisdiction of the mayor's office. So I don't deal with school food, and I don't deal with health and hospitals. So what can I say about what we do? For the city, there is a procurement policy board. And they come up with rules and regulations that govern procurement, talk about, all the legal aspects of how procurement works is in this document, which is, I think, like 200 to 300 pages of rules and regulations, which is not the most exciting things to read, but that's what we go to when we need to sort of decide what's right or wrong to do. And also within, so that document governs all procurement processes for everyone in the city. Now, what can I say about procurement? There are different categories of procurement. There are centralized procurement and there are decentralized procurement. And what does that mean? It means that it depends on the dollar value of the contracts. For the city of New York, if the estimated value of the contracts is under $100,000, it's done at the city agency. So all the city agencies have to do their own procurements. If the contract value is under $100,000, if it's over $100,000, then we do centralized procurement, and that's where I sit. So, like there are a lot of agencies who are buying food, but because they are buying smaller amounts of food, they do the procurements by themselves or through their own procurement shop. But then for procurements that are over $100,000, it comes to my office, and we execute the procurement on behalf of those agencies. There are also goods and services, and those procurements are very different. So for example, Department of Homeless Services, they hire a catering service to feed the homeless population, but we don't do that procurement because that's a service. In our office, we do goods. So we're actually buying actual food ingredients for agencies to prepare food. There are also, accelerated and non-accelerated procurements, because procurements have a lot of processes that you have to go through in order to register the contract. Some commodities are subject to a faster procurement process, and food is one of them, because for example, food and fuel and a few of other commodities are in greater public necessity. So we're able to accomplish those procurements in a faster way. But if you're buying vehicles or office supplies, those are non-accelerated procurements. So those are longer procurements. Now, and then there are different procurement methods that we use to execute our procurements. I think the two most popular or two most widely used procurement methods is called competitive seal bid, where we put out a bid, all the vendors fill out the bid with their pricing, they seal it, and they mail it to us, or now they submit it to us on the internet by a due date, and then we award according to their qualifications that meet the specifications, and according to the price point. So competitive seal bid, generally speaking, we award to the lowest bidder whose items meet qualifications. And then RFPs take a bit longer, request for proposals, which is the other mechanism that we use for procurement. But that requires, you have a lot of different evaluation criterias, and vendors have to submit a lot of supporting documentation for those procurements, and those procurements usually take much longer because they're a little bit more complicated. But for food, at least, in my office, which we deal with centralized procurement, we do competitive seal bid. That is a process that we utilize in the office that I am in. So what can I tell you about the portfolio that we manage here? The three agencies that we procure for generally is Department of Corrections. A lot of we procure all the food for Rikers Island. Administration for Children's Services. There are juvenile centers where there are feeding programs that are important, and also NYPD. One interesting tidbit of fact I like to tell people is that we also feed the dogs and the horses of NYPD. So we do the procurement on behalf of the agencies, and just outlining a general process. The agencies do menu planning. They decide what they want to put on the menu, all the ingredients that need to go into creating the meals. They work with their dietitian, the nutritionists at the agency level to make sure that it's nutritionally appropriate for the population. And then they prepare a requisition document that comes to us here at Department of Citywide Procurement. And then with me and my staff and my team, we put together bids with the items and the specification, nutritional requirements, anything else that is important to a particular food item. And then we put it out on the street for bidding. Any vendor out there who is interested in bidding on our contracts can submit a bid. There's a due date, and then we spend a lot of time evaluating the bidders and what they propose, the prices, and make sure that they meet all the specifications outline for each item, like make sure that it's not too salty, it's not, it's not too fatty, that it's got a minimum, number of fiber requirements depending on the item. So then we award the contracts once we make the determination of the lowest bidder that meets all the qualifications, and then we award the vendors. Obviously there's a lot that goes into the beginning and the beginning and the awarding process. But in general, we follow the city's fiscal year, which starts on July 1st. So we try to do our bids and awarding process the first half of the fiscal year. Now, just to give a little bit more color of our portfolio, we procure things like fresh fruits and vegetables. Those, we try to source locally if possible. We have bids that go out for dairy products, like milk is a big item, eggs, cheese, things of that nature are needed for the menus. Also, we procure, special foods that are kosher and halal because there are populations that require kosher foods, especially around now where there's a lot of Jewish holidays. Also, we have a halal population. So we have to go out and find those types of products as well. Processed fresh and frozen foods are also important, like frozen vegetables, certain frozen sort of like meat patties and things of that nature we also procure. Also meats and poultry. Okay, we also do that. So that just gives you a little bit of color of what we do. I think our annual portfolio is around $100 million that we award to a variety of vendors. So that's kind of like Procurement 101. Now, getting to what we're talking about today, the Good Food Purchasing Program, advancing racial equity. In the procurement policy rules, advancing social welfare is not really baked in there. So when you want to kind of promote a certain, social element in our procurement processes, it's a little bit more difficult because at the end of the day, what the Procurement Policy Board wants to make sure is that there's healthy competition. Because otherwise, if you're like, I only want to buy this item made this way with this certification, well, there might be only one vendor in the entire US that will supply that. So that's not exactly good competition. So what procurement, the legal folks at procurement care about is that there's healthy competition to make sure that we are able to get the best product at the best price. So because of that, sometimes advancing social welfare issues can be somewhat difficult. Like one effort that's not food that has been somewhat successful is like eliminating, the city has came up with an executive order to eliminate plastic water bottles, single-use plastics. I think we are also now, we can buy used plastic bags. In the past, I think during the Bloomberg administration, we tried to eliminate sugary drinks. That wasn't very successful. So advancing social welfare issues through, the procurement process is not that simple. We can't just say, oh, we're going to buy from this farmer who has, organic eggs that's grass-fed, and it's that we can't just do that unless it follows the procurement rules and laws. So what does that mean? Well, really what we need are executive orders, and we need policy that help us advance these things, these endeavors. So for the city, we do have a few. We have a few food policies and executive orders that help us advance, local suppliers, improve nutrition. One of which is New York State local sourcing. We have a local law that gives price preference to New York State grown, sourced, and processed foods. Those vendors get a bit of a price deduction, so they're a little bit more competitive when we're evaluating the bid. Obviously, we have the New York food standards that's put out by health and hospitals, by the health department, that outlines the nutritional requirements of certain food products, limits on sugar, limits on salt. Those all vendors have to comply to, all the menus have to comply to those New York food standards. Most relevant to what we're talking about today is the MWBE certification, the Minority Women-Owned Business certification that MWBE vendors can get, which can give them an advantage when it comes to procurement with the city. However, that only comes into play at the decentralized procurements, where the agencies have to go out and bid for these items. They can use a pool of MWBE vendors. With centralized procurement, which is what we do, it doesn't come into play as much, but we do try very hard to work with MWBE vendors to help them along with the procurement process if they want to work with one of our bids. And of course, we have adopted the Good Food Purchasing Program, which Dakari spoke about. That comes into, has different values that we strive for. So yeah, am I running out of time? I might be running out of time, but I guess because procurement is where the policy meets the practice, the question is, what does racial equity look like in food procurement? What does it mean exactly? What are the goals and how do we measure? Because at the end of the day, we have to be accountable to the public. How do we measure, advancement in racial equity? Is it dollars spent on MWE vendors? Is it the number of MWE vendors that have contracts? Or is it possibly like the menus are more diverse, like the foods that are served at institutions are more inclusive of different ethnic foods and cuisines of different cultures? So it's I think I have more questions than answers when I think about this, and I think that's why we're here to talk about this. But just I guess I can't go on and on, but just to kind of like wrap it up, we have to remember that the food supply chain, there are many players in the food supply chain. There are growers, there are producers, there are manufacturers, there are distributors, there are transporters, there are buyers, there are sellers. And finally, there are the people who eat the food. So sometimes, because this is such a huge, big question, you really have to kind of drill down on where along the supply chain that we might want to work on. Because when it comes to procurement, it's baby steps. It's really baby steps. One question that comes to mind is in this food supply chain, where are there more opportunities for MWB vendors to participate in? What types of food, for example, halal and processed foods, halal and kosher foods are probably have more available MWB vendors that can supply food products. So it's really thinking hard about category of food, where in the supply chain that we want to target, that maybe we can move the needle a little bit. And obviously from where I sit, from the agency level sit, we're more on the demand side of the equation rather than the supply side. So, I execute the procurements, but I buy whatever the agencies tell me to buy. So I also believe in, kind of like a bottom-up approach, like what are some of the foods that we can serve that is more diverse? And then finally, just to end, how can existing policy tools that we have, how can current policy tools support that? One example is the New York City food standards, which is based on the science of nutrition, is it workable with, like the science of nutrition, is broken down by, different, like nutritional elements of food. Is it workable with different types of dishes from different cuisines? Like how easy is it to, like I come from a Chinese culture background, like how easy it is to implement a dish that I eat at home with my family using the New York food standards. And similarly, we have a price preference for local suppliers, but maybe we should have a price preference for MWB vendors, but that requires an executive, a local law that could be put in place. So there's a lot of open-ended questions. I think it's very complex. I definitely appreciate a lot of the work that advocacy groups do because they bring a lot to the table. So I think I'll end there because I'm like over time. Rachel can speak next. I've worked a lot with Rachel in trying to move the needle, and she can sort of provide her perspective from a vendor's point of view, which, like we've talked a lot and really tried to work hard on, advancing items purchased through the complicated procurement rules to further social, social endeavors. So I'll just end there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Fatai, for your remarks. We know that procurement processes can be very opaque and wonky, so I appreciate you taking the time to clarify for us what procurement is and how it functions, frankly, here in New York City. I'll just quickly say that I also personally appreciated that you lifted up that the dollars that are being spent by our public institutions are taxpayers' dollars. And this is important subtext here because when we talk about institutional food, that's what we're talking about. We know how important it is for our institutions to procure food that's in line with the values of the residents that it served. And as you mentioned, also remain accountable to the public. So I just wanted to mention that before we transition into Rachel's remarks. And just for quick context, everyone, again, Rachel Terry is a National Partnerships Director at the Common Market. She'll speak for the next few minutes. We'll then transition into a panel discussion in the next 12 or so minutes, where you'll hear a little bit more from the panelists here, have an opportunity for us to dig into some of the questions that you all have. So Rachel, I'll turn it over to you too.
Great, thank you so much. Awesome. Well, hi, everyone, and thank you for giving me the space to speak about our perspective here. My name is Rachel Terry. I am the National Partnerships Director at the Common Market, and appreciate going kind of in this order because I think I will be sharing the perspective of a vendor and someone that works directly with small and mid-sized family farms, and how the supply chain and value chain coordination piece of this work fits in to how we can really leverage public procurement to advance and center racial equity into those purchasing dollars. So I'll speak a little bit about Common Market, our work, then we'll also dive into some of the specific initiatives that we're working on right now with some pilots in the Southeast with growers of color, as well as a procurement resource guide we're going to be launching in the next few weeks. So just to start with a little bit about the Common Market, we are a nonprofit local food aggregator and distributor. Our mission is to connect small and mid-sized family farms to institutions and the communities that those institutions serve. And just a quick note that, pretty much since our founding, anchor institutions like our hospitals, our universities, public schools, government agencies have really been our core market and the way that we develop our supply chains. And that's really because, as echoed in the conversation thus far, we recognize that those areas, those procurement and institutional places are often where our most vulnerable populations are accessing their meals each day. And we also know that those institutions truly have the purchasing power to shift dynamics and build resiliency into local, regional, and equitable food systems. So just some background on how Common Market came to be and kind of the scope of our work before we dive into the topic at hand. The picture on the right are Hailey Johnston and Tatiana Garcia Granados, our co-founders. of the common market. And they started this work out of the food security challenges that they were seeing and witnessing in their own community in North Philadelphia, where their neighbors and their community members were struggling to access high quality, good food. And at the same time, we're having conversations with farmers and producers in the rural areas right outside of Philly who are also struggling to remain viable, to find meaningful market opportunities. And there was this real disconnect between communities who were struggling to access good food and farmers who were struggling to find meaningful market. And so the common market really came to be by providing the physical infrastructure, relationship building. You know, we have our own physical warehouses, trucks, and we're connecting small, mid-sized growers, aggregating their products, and then making deliveries directly to institutions across the regions that we serve. And so we were founded in 2008 in Philadelphia, and that hub services the Mid-Atlantic region from New York City to DC. And then about 8 years ago, began expanding our model, recognizing that these same challenges around food access and grower viability existed across the country. And so we first expanded into the Southeast region. We have a hub in East Point, Georgia. And then about 4 years ago, launched in Houston, Texas, and currently doing some supply chain coordinations and looking to launch in the Great Lakes region as well. You can go to the next slide. So our work, you know, our mission is really twofold. It's on building farmer capacity and viability, and then it's helping to connect that product to the communities who need it most. And so we'll touch a bit on what, you know, for the purpose of this conversation, what this work has looked like on the farm support side. You know, we work with a diverse network of growers, you know, mixed specialty produce crops. We work with ranchers. We're doing value-added products. And for a lot of our growers, we might be the first wholesale distributor that they're working with. So a lot of work that we do is on general wholesale readiness. So what are the, you know, insurance requirements that are going to be needed? What are pack specs that our institutional buyers are going to be looking for? And how can we support growers to make sure that they're facilitating their supply chain in a way that can meet the needs of the institutional demand? Increasingly, we also are seeing the importance and recognize the importance of food safety and helping our growers invest in the food safety practices that they need in order to sell into those institutional markets. So providing consultants and technical assistance for produce growers to get GAP certified, and other sorts of critical food safety requirements so that all growers can access the institutional market. We do a lot of work around crop planning, and we'll be speaking a little bit to that on how that is supported from the institutional side as well. But of course, working with growers so that they have a sense of what product needs to go into the ground, where that product's going to go, and we can really be a partner and a co-creator of the work that they're seeding so that these farms can thrive. And then lastly, you know, all of this work really sits in this value chain coordination role. You know, for myself and others on our team, you know, I'm having conversations with institutions, with buyers, and then I'm trying to translate that work right back into our grower network. We're the ones that are having those conversations. We're the ones that are seeing the bids and the solicitation opportunities that are out there and identifying where those contracts could be a good fit for local, regional, equitable food systems, and where there might need to be some nuance on both ends to really leverage the public plate and institutional procurement in a way that can meet the needs of both these growers and the operations, like what Fatai runs each day here in the city, and really make that balance work. So to the next slide, you know, as we translate to this conversation and the topic around advancing racial equity, you know, I think, of course, it's incredibly important to note there is a whole diversity of growers across the supply chain, and in particular at the common market. I think we are really focused specifically on some of the work with Black growers in particular. And I imagine that many of us that are part of this conversation, a map and a graph like this is not new. But just recognizing that the shift in Black land ownership and Black run operations from the 1920s to today is stark. And today, you know, a real concentration of Black farmers exists in the South. When we look to the work that we're doing, and for the context of this, in New York, you know, less than 0.2% of land ownership is from Black-owned farms. And when we really try to center the role of racial equity and the role of institutional procurement in trying to rectify or kind of reimagine how we can recenter power and opportunity for these growers, you know, a lot of our work has really been focused on supporting and creating specific market opportunities for growers of color more broadly, but also important to note the specific role of uplifting Black farms in our supply chain. So how are we doing this? I think we all are here and having this conversation because we recognize that there is true power in institutional procurement. There is a lot of purchasing power. There is the responsive needs of taxpayer dollars. And of course, I think one of the things in a role like what I sit in is institutional procurement is actually a really reliable and sustainable market opportunity for growers. When you compare the way that institutional procurement flows compared to the retail setting or even restaurant setting, potentially much more volatile markets, for institutions, they generally have a sense of how many people they're feeding each day. They have menus. They are putting out bids for advanced purchasing opportunities. And so for a grower, an institutional market can really be a steady, meaningful planning and investment opportunity to build resiliency into local food systems. And so I think there's so much in the power of institutional procurement, but also what it means for a grower to understand that they have potentially a contract or they have this consistent supply opportunity. It really embeds even additional power and opportunity in this type of work. So I'm going to touch a little bit on how we're translating that a bit in our work in the Southeast. This picture here is of the Coastal Georgia Small Farmers Cooperative. This is a co-op that was founded in 1988. It's founded by 5 Black veteran farmers in Glenville, Georgia. And prior to Common Market working with this co-op, they were really reliant on the retail market. And then due to some changing market demands, the price of their product fell higher than what others in the state were able to offer, and they lost their most meaningful market outlets. And so these are growers that know the land, that are excited to grow healthful, nutritious foods, and are really just looking for market opportunity. And so our work in the Southeast right now is with growers like this and with others, and having conversations with the institutions in the state to really share this story and to help them reimagine how they might shift some of their purchasing practices to support growers like this. I think especially when we're talking about farms and co-ops that have gone through these sorts of flows in the market, there is a lot of mistrust, and thinking about how institutions can help prioritize. And what we're doing specifically in the Southeast is asking some of these institutional partners to set forward commitments for these growers. So we're planning, we're looking at their menus, and a lot of these institutions in September, October, November are creating crop plans for the following year so that these growers, before they're even planting seeds in the ground, know exactly how much product they're going to be moving to these institutions, and they can invest in their land, they can invest in their operation, they can access capital, they now have some of these purchase orders in place. And it's really kind of, I think, reimagining the role that some of these institutions can play in prioritizing and centering what growers might need to build back some of that trust and build back some of that capacity. So to the next slide, I also wanted to share a little bit about a tool that we're going to be launching in the next few weeks here, and it's a resource guide that's called Tools to Fuel Values-Based Purchasing. And this really came out of our own experience and interest in seeing the importance of contract language to facilitate values-based procurement. And we scanned the country for examples of values-based procurement and values from local purchasing to environmental sustainability, racial equity as well. And scanned some of those public procurements, as well as had a suite of stakeholder interviews to really dive into like what has to exist to move the needle on this work. And so if you go to the next slide here are just a few of the strategies for success that really got lifted up through these interviews and really diving deep into these contracts. So I think the first, and Vitai lifted this up as well, but I think recognizing baseline for us to advance racial equity as part of public procurement and any other value as well, it is a deviation from the system in its way that it is today. It is a shift from a low-cost procurement model to one where we are embedding values and reconsidering the way that our procurement processes occur. And often what that means is that the procurement process might take more time, and it might take more buy-in and support from all levels of leadership and decision-making across the supply chain. And so it's not just the buyer that you're talking to, but it's perhaps their boss, or it's the policies and systems that even exist within the city or the state. And it truly is going to take that buy-in and dedication from all levers in order to really move the needle on this. And I think for us in a lot of these value chain coordination roles, also recognizing a little bit of the care and the grace that, you know, working with an institution to advance this, that it is taking more time for that individual to do this work, and recognizing that there is a lot to be learned on both sides of the supply chain to really move that forward. This was also touched on a little bit, but I think it's important to obviously understand, you know, institutions have to follow the procurement rules that are most restrictive from within the county or the city or the state that they exist. And so it's incredibly important to really understand what those policies are, and either identify contract language that fits within those restrictions, or potentially, you know, identify advocacy channels to enact new policy or shift policy that allows for a more inclusive procurement process. Increasingly, in a lot of the solicitations that we reviewed, there's a huge shift in building more accountability into contracts, and that can really look like asking for standard reporting or traceability, putting questions in that are asking about the types of suppliers that you're working with. And it starts to signal to the market that these are values that your institutions care about, that these are questions that you want answers to. And maybe if it's even at a stage at this point where you're not awarding any additional prioritization, but you're just starting to push and move the needle on what are the criteria and the accountability metrics that we're going to include in our contracts. And then, you know, I think especially important to note when we're talking about this conversation around racial equity is that a lot of these supply chains might not be at the scale and at the level of wholesale readiness that institutions need tomorrow, that it's not just a turn of the switch solution, that there have been years of systemic decisions that have made it incredibly challenging for certain growers to compete at the scale that other growers across the supply chain are at. And so recognizing how we can maybe start small, how we can pilot things, how we can break up contracts so that there's multiple levels of engagement and opportunities, so that that institutional procurement really can be an avenue for multiple levels of engagement and different types of vendors to participate. And so you can go to the next slide. I'll just end with a few of the specific types of language that we saw included in solicitations through this review. You know, we lifted up MWBE preference, and I think that's probably the most widespread that we're seeing across the supply chain. And interestingly, we had a conversation with Buffalo Public Schools. You know, they were really excited to be, you know, to try to work with more diverse suppliers. And they found that a lot of the growers that they were, you know, hoping to support were not MWBE certified. For many small producers, getting a certification might not be viable in the short term. And so they were looking for potentially other solutions to address the outcome that they were intending. And they looked to the precedent of the USDA socially disadvantaged definition and allowed vendors to kind of self-identify under that definition. And within their procurement rules, that was something that their procurement office was able to pilot with them. Again, I noted traceability and reporting. I think it's an incredibly important tool of just continuing to build more transparency into how we procure. And then lastly, in any solicitation, there's a vendor questionnaire, and we really did see that, you know, we saw that being lifted up oftentimes as a way to ask questions about, you know, the ownership structures of the vendor, potentially of the different suppliers that they're using, and using that as information and potentially preference depending on the type of contract that you're running, to identify who's going to, you know, be able to compete and ultimately be awarded certain opportunities. So I'll dive into more of that in our discussion, but thank you so much for the time, and appreciate getting to be here among our other panelists.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for specifically also sharing the strategies that the Common Market utilizes and operationalizes to connect both your organizational values to tangible practices. I really appreciated that. You also offered us nuance by not only amplifying the reliability that can come with institutional food contracts, but also the value of normalizing accountability and transparency as part of how institutional food purchasing decisions are made. There were gems that the three of you shared that for me personally gave me a lot of hope, and expanded how we can think about the value of transforming our institutional food systems and our food systems at large in our local, regional, and national food systems. So just a quick pulse check, just to share with everyone. We're going to transition into about a 15 or so minute Q&A. I'll pose a couple of questions. So I just want to encourage everyone. I'm sure a lot of questions emerged as part of this discussion. So I'll just remind you all to note them. We're going to open up the chat during this discussion segment, but it'll only come towards the moderator, host, and the panelists and co-hosts. So I just encourage you to send questions in the chat portion, and we'll lift them up once we get to the Q&A portion that we then open up to the audience. So I just want to lift that up. And I also just want to mention, I know we only have about 23 or so minutes left on this particular panel, but as was mentioned earlier, the conversation and of course the work does not stop at 11:30. So there are going to be a lot of opportunities for you all to connect with Cuny and with all of the panelists here and with myself and with others to make sure that feedback loops are meaningfully created to ensure that there are opportunities to amplify the work that you're hearing about today. So I'll just start. I'm gonna pose this to Marley. So I'll give my official introduction to Marley. As was mentioned earlier, Marley is the Good Food Purchasing Project Manager at the Chicago Food Policy Action Council. She's a special guest here in the audience. I've worked very closely with Marley, and we constantly share best practices across here in New York City and New York State, and Chicago and Cook County. And Marley, it would be wonderful if you can just elaborate a little bit more on the collaboration and the coordination between the Chicago Food Policy Action Council and the City of Chicago and the surrounding Cook County throughout the process of implementing good food purchasing. What does that intersection look like? What's been meaningful about that process?
Yeah, thanks, Ribka. Yeah, that collaboration has been critical for implementing the good food purchasing policy at both the City of Chicago, Chicago Public Schools, Chicago Park District, and Cook County government. We've worked very closely with our partners at the Chicago Department of Public Health, the Mayor's Office, and the Cook County Department of Public Health on direct technical assistance to departments and agencies that are working through the good food purchasing program process that the city and county have passed as a resolution. So that has looked like checking in with them on a regular basis to help them work with their contracted vendors and suppliers on data collection. We've talked a lot about transparency this morning already, but that's one of the biggest challenges of this work is transparency in food procurement and where products are coming from and their specifications, their price points, their volume, and all of that transparency is necessary for us to understand the landscape of what's being purchased and how it relates to the values that we care about. And we work very closely with our partners, national partners at the Center for Good Food Purchasing to analyze that data and provide us with really helpful reports on, percentage of spend that is local, sustainable, healthy, fair, humane. But we can't do that unless we're working really closely with departments and agencies on that data collection process and shifting their contracts, their solicitations, their RFPs, use invitations for bid here in Illinois quite often. So trying to shift the language of solicitations to explicitly embed language around data collection, transparency, reporting, adherence to the good food purchasing standards and aspirational goals. And that's been a really collaborative process between the Chicago Food Policy Action Council, our partners in the broader Good Food Purchasing Initiative, and the city and the county. We are also in that process, co-chairing the two advisory bodies that the city and county are operating to implement GFPP. So the city, that's the mayor's office's Food Equity Council. They have an institutional procurement working group, and CIVPAC has been co-chairing that. And there are like 20 plus folks that sit on that working group from both the city and the community informing the direction of GFPP implementation. So it's really collaborative there. And then at the county, similar body meets quarterly. It's called the Cook County Good Food Task Force, and we co-facilitate and convene that with the county. It's been critical for us to be involved also as in recognizing that we are within the same region, the city and county overlapping region, and with that, we are all working and operating in the same food system. So this is a great opportunity for us to be building out collaboratively this broader umbrella initiative of the Metro Chicago Good Food Purchasing Initiative, so we can set research priorities collectively and understand and learn best practices from each other, but also, recognize that we can be, kind of working smarter, not harder, if we're working in collaboration across jurisdictions on good food procurement within the region. So that's just, some of the ways in which we've been collaborating, but we've found that kind of working both within, with our government partners and, community partners and kind of stakeholders across the supply chain has really informed the direction of GFPP implementation in a way that, it wouldn't be if, if we were kind of siloed from each other.
So many gems. Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Marley. For adding some additional context to that. So I'm curious, I'll pose this question out to the entire panel, of course, Marley included, for anybody that wants to answer. What are some of the potential shortcomings of existing solutions to addressing racial disparities and racial inequity through public food procurement? Does anyone want to start us on that?
I could jump in. I got a list, keep a list. One of the biggest ones I think is just like the assumption that certifications are the only barrier disrupting BIPOC businesses and enter into like wholesale markets. Then I would say, so going back to that, I guess like just like building up the infrastructure of like what that looks like. It's like, one, we need to address like some of the 4 biggest barriers of like food equity being instilled in or like racial equity being instilled within like the food landscape. One of them is just being like opportunities for BIPOC farmers and food business owners to grow and develop and flourish within this space, access to land, access to water, and access to capital. We look at these things, well, here, like we've been fortunate enough to really gain some support, and one, getting that good food purchasing policy enacted. But that's only, it's like a framework tool. So it highlights some of the essential points that like we need to really look at to talk about values-based procurement. But also is developing like the entire food landscape in total, because it's a lot of energy being put into like developing a food system. And so regardless of if folks are selling into institutions or not, this is beneficial for community health overall. And so it's just been made possible by utilizing some of those like socio and political leveraging points, such as like, one, talking to values aligned nonprofits and advocates, community organizations, research institutions that conduct some evaluation efforts around like, okay, how can we use values-based or asset-based community development? For example, we have a ton of like lots that's underutilized, which become dangerous spots within community. We have grocery stores that's shutting down that could be used as like cold storage facilities, that could be used as like convenient points. Just like being able to like reimagine the food system at large. And then looking at some different ways that we could, kind of talk about fund distribution. But these are all solutions to like some of those shortcomings of saying like, okay, now that we have these certifications, we have opportunity, but it's like, it doesn't really stop there. So just looking at some of the resources that institutions really have to support the development and acquisition of land also. So addressing some of the nuanced, complex, and potentially distracting language used in contracting and bidding. If it's not in layman's terms, people aren't really aware of like how to really engage with it. Distracting language, I'm going to name it more directly. Socially disadvantaged. A lot of folks don't really like to identify with that. Good food procurement is like, we're talking about a business transaction, but we're using framework and language that's talking about this needs to be human-centered. So like these are like, you know, dog whistles that people hear like when we're engaging in this work too. So like just really like addressing and naming that specifically. Asking if there are like affordable legal aid resources provided for emerging food business owners who are entering into this contracting and licensing process. Asking folks to do things that they aren't already doing when it's entities that exist to, you know, kind of support that work to develop a little bit more. Unrealistic expectations of scale and capacity within these contracts that's coming up. And then just ultimately like cultural shifts and procurement practices. And saying like, all right, how have we come up with some of these standards of success? Have they been mutually agreed upon by all parties involved? Or are we subjecting folks to, this is what success looks like, and this is like how these are the agreements that we come up with, and now people are like subjugated to following that. So those are just some of the shortcomings that I've seen like within institutional selling and just like introducing some of that language into the conversations that we're having broadly.
Anybody want to follow up with that?
Sure, I can say a few words about that. I think that like one of, I don't know if it's I mean, it is an obstacle, but I think like there should be a way to do this a little bit better is connecting, you know, like Rachel spoke of how some vendor, you know, like BIPOC vendors cannot produce at the scale that is appropriate for large institutions. So how do we get the right scale demand to and with the vendors who can produce at the right scale, how do those opportunities find each other? Because like you know, like a lot of decentralized procurement that I'm speaking of happens at the agency level, and I think that is a space where a lot of, you know, BIPOC vendors can get involved with, but yet they don't know how to, you know, find those opportunities. So I think that's something that is definitely a, you know, like an information, you know, like kink in the information flow. Like how do you connect like the right scale of demand with the right scale of supply? Like that's, I think, is important. You know, and another thing that Dakari spoke of is like we are talking about value-based. But right now, as we currently operate, we are, you know, we all know the best food is not the cheapest food. So how do we shift the procurement process to enable us to purchase better quality food at a higher price? How do we justify it? How do we, like, for example, you know, like just from a very concrete practice, like if we want to buy organic chicken versus conventional chicken, organic chicken is going to be like, I don't know, like 50 more cents per pound. Well, if an institution is buying like 100,000, you know, like 1 million pounds of chicken, you know, like they have to come up with like a lot more money just to buy this one food item. So how can the budgeting process, you know, like be more amenable to spending more money on food? Because that's a really big issue right there. At the end of the day, it's how much money we're spending, and how do we justify it, and how do we allow for it? So I think I had one other comment, but I can't think of it right now. So I don't know if anyone else wants to jump in.
I just add, and I think it's picking up on Dakari on a lot of your comments. I mean, I think viewing institutional procurement as, you know, if we put more language in or if we shift some pieces, that's going to be enough, I think is in and of itself a big shortcoming. You know, obviously there's a lot of power in institutional procurement and there needs to be some of that language in there, but especially when we're talking about racial equity and the realities of where some of these supply chains are, it's going to take more than just an institution saying, I want to do this tomorrow. It's going to be, what are the investments that are going to be made? What are the commitments that are going to be needed, and what are the like public and private partnerships that are going to need to be uplifted in order to really facilitate that. And so I think it's being wary of recognizing that there's so much more that needs to occur outside of just the conditions of the contracts, and making sure that we're centering the voices and the realities of the people most affected by that in any of those solutions as well.
I think you all lifted up how multidimensional and how multi-layered this work is, which is also why I'm happy that the four panelists here are having this conversation in line with one another, because you all approach this conversation from a different vantage point, which I think is one of the many values of this conversation. So one of the questions that I had really centered around the different policy options and implementation strategies that you'd recommend to achieve greater racial equity in the food system by leveraging the public plate. And just to weave in, if you don't mind, one of the questions that I got in the chat, one thing that was lifted up from Fatai's presentation was around a structural challenge that many cities face. The procurement laws and regulations make it difficult to prefer food with better racial equity, environmental, and other social outcomes. As the person noted, the participant noted here, you mentioned, Fatai, that these are largely geared towards getting the best price. And though we know that the lowest price food comes with, as you were mentioning, as you were starting to speak to, enormous hidden costs to people and the planet. So this is really to everyone. What needs to change? Legislation, procurement officer mindsets, and the will, and their will, mayoral priorities, in order to truly clear and pave the way for preferring food that might be slightly more expensive, but that more than pays for itself in health, economic, and environmental benefits. I'm seeing nods. I think all of us
It's
think
like
about this regularly.
all of our brains are turning. I mean, like I like one experience that I had recently is so we all know that like the plant-based plate is like really big, with the mayor. I guess just generally overall, like in the entire US, we want to go towards more of a plant-based food product. And we recently, were invited to go to the Javits Center for the plant-based food show. And what was interesting is, I don't know, I mean, this talks into like who is kind of like narrating the plant-based movement, because when you go to the plant show, it's mostly all fake meats, highly processed fake meats. I don't think I ate a single piece of vegetable at the food show. But yet that is kind of like the cultural trend narrated plant-based movement. And you really have to question, like, what are the power dynamics baked into, this plant-based movement? But then again, these things cost a lot of money. Like if you want to buy like Beyond Burger or Impossible Burger, those things are very expensive. But at the same time, maybe like, and I'm sort of going on a tangent here, but kind of like brings this full back, because we're always thinking about ways to promote the plant-based diet. There are also a lot of vegetarian cultures in the world where they eat a lot of vegetarian foods that is cheap to cook, cheap to grow, cheap to make. So I guess like there's kind of like the policy aspect of it, which is like, and there's like the procurement rule aspect of it, which are difficult to kind of work around, but there's also like, I don't know, like cultural ways to work around it as well. And now I completely forgot what your original question was, but there's just like so many different aspects of it that's very complicated to kind of bring to fruition.
If it's helpful for the other panelists too, I'll just restate, excuse me, the crux of the question is, what needs to change in order to clear the way for preferring food that may slightly be more expensive, but that pays for itself ultimately in health, economic, and environmental benefits.
If I may, I got another list, but and I know we have limited time, so forgive me if I start ignoring grammatic syntax and hit some Tarzan language. But one of the points is just like one, uplifting existing leadership from communities that are being centered, hire representatives from the communities that you want to serve for leadership positions in council. Looking at like the standpoint theory, right, of saying that like, okay, it's a dominant structure in this space, right, and that's where like all the resources and power like kind of accumulated, and that doesn't really give you like a ton of perspective because it becomes like an echo chamber of like we got the same idea, and this idea is supposed to benefit a community that we aren't frequently interacting with, and that's, I think, is a shortcoming in like a lot of decision making practices. So like, if we're talking about marginalized community, that's another distracting word, right? The marginalized community. But if we're talking about marginalized community for the lack of better words, we see like where the power is, because it's a lack of power like within this space right here, or a different type of power at least. And we say, okay, things could be bridged and this gap could be fulfilled if we have like access to this accumulated power in the middle. So like if you hire folks from like that broader perspective to kind of come in and shift with those conversations, you got real representation in the mix, and some accurate voice to just build up that perspective. Then two, just asking questions are, how accessible is your public institution? And is the food that you have within that public institution culturally relevant? And do you all partner with neighboring organizations? Or like, how do you, like, what resources do you have to partner with neighboring organizations? Then going into like utilizing more environmentally responsible packaging. Marginalized communities within cities are the most affected by environmental injustice all the time. So like waste runoff, not really having like political voice and saying we don't want this factory in here. That's like disrupting, our ecosystem and our health primarily, which sends us back to this public institution of a hospital where we can't really afford to get treatment there because maybe we might not be insured. So like it becomes like a positive feedback loop of like negative effects. And then going into institutions considering the infrastructure needed to mitigate food waste and partnering with food mobilization and rescue organizations. So if we are going to be like having this like larger intake of like food, what's already going on with our food waste? How do we measure that? And what's our like infrastructure of like how to get rid of it in a way where like we're repurposing it and still like honoring this food that we have and making sure it gets to a safe place. And then lastly, I guess just like one, talking into like future planning to protect and support street vendors. Chicago, New York, immigrant cities, sanctuary cities. That food is culturally relevant. It's establishing, it's really supporting our already established entrepreneurship models. And that needs to be uplifted within the procurement, food equity, food sovereignty, food justice movement through and through. And so like lastly, I guess like the note I'll leave on is just not forgetting that like we're all like within this ecosystem, right? And saying like, okay, like this, we shouldn't have like a separate relationship with our food. And we got to like realize like we all have like a contributing point and like our existence and how we kind of like interact with this. So I guess to like just avoid that social impact tourism that happens sometimes if like people come in and we starting to like work towards this idea and we have like a lot of energy invested into this movement and concept. And then it kind of drops off or like this conversation ends at this moment because I'm almost out of time. But just making sure we find those places that keep that conversation going so that it's not a tourism model, but more so like we're actually saying we're part of this community and we're honed in here. And let's continue to build this up in a more equitable way, regardless if it's going to procurement standards or not. How do we support like our local farmers and food business owners?
Ooh, so rich. Oh, so rich. I personally have so many thoughts to respond to it but I know in the interest of time, I'll reserve that for another moment. I just wanted to mention it is 11:30 Eastern at least. For those of us who can stay on for a couple of minutes past, we can continue the discussion. There were a couple more questions that came up. I'm not sure if folks have the ability to stay on for a few more minutes, maybe 3 or 4 more minutes. Okay, I just want to be conscientious of everyone's time. I know this is a really rich conversation that of course doesn't end now. I'll ask 2 more questions. One is going to be the closing question. So just just in the interest of time, there were a couple of points where we just generally lifted up how incredibly complex these systems are. So Brian Sobel lifted up in the chat. As Fatai mentioned, these systems are incredibly complex. And as Dakari mentioned, there are opportunities for systemic exclusion at every step, despite the best intentions. So are there processes or mechanisms in place to both tell the story, but also make sure that unintended consequences are accounted for and mitigated? I know that data transparency and accountability were talked about. So what was lifted up in this question is, how do we center how we think about how data is collected, what data is collected, what the metrics are, and how they're used to inform decision-making. I know that that's a lot to cover in a couple of minutes, but just to put that on the table, if anybody has a 30-second response to that, any immediate reflections?
I mean, I'll share, I think, I think it's really important for anyone doing this work to consider, like, as you add more criteria or think about how you embed values-based procurement into solicitation, how any additional requirement could or could not unintentionally prevent somebody that might be the intended recipient or beneficiary of that language from actually participating. And so I think, in our experience, and even in this procurement guide that all these interviews that we engaged in, there was a lot of process of like putting out a solicitation, seeing who actually responded, having vendor meetings, like what the SIPPAC team is doing, to hear from people, to hear about like what's working, what's not. And I think being really clear on what the goals are and what the intended and unintended outcomes are, and being willing to iterate and recognize that, like, I think if we had figured this out, we wouldn't be having this conversation. Like, all of us are doing this work because we're trying to move the needle and ultimately shift the dynamics of how food is moved and prioritized. And so I think being open to the fact that, like, making these conversations a two-way street, iterating, seeing what happened, and then going back to the drawing board of like, what could we have done differently, I think are a lot of the practices we're seeing in this space. And to the point of even like data transparency and data asks, I think for some, and I think for some smaller vendors or distributors, traceability and data is actually like adds a lot of value. Like, it's pretty simple for a smaller food hub or others. That's just the way that their supply chains are set up to provide that data, but also that it takes time. So there are definitely trade-offs to both regard. But I think it does move the needle in the direction of actually asking the questions of who is being supported by this work, and how can we continue to improve.
Thank you for that, Rachel. I know it's not easy to fit in an answer to that in a very short period of time. To quickly just share the texture of the remaining questions that we've not been able to get to, just so folks here know what's sort of been posed in the chat. There were some questions specifically regarding the crop planning that you had mentioned earlier, Rachel, mentioned as a key activity that Common Market engages in. So there was a question around if there are binding forward contracts in place to substantiate intentional crop planning with growing, and if they're multi-year, and if not, how those growers plant or produce with confidence that the market will follow through. There was also a question about details regarding procurement preference amongst producers. That was specified towards you, Rachel. And then there was a comment too that came to us from Denver that one strategy that was employed was aligning the mayoral priorities with their purchasing practices, knowing that he's promoting environmental sustainability gave them more power in translating those priorities into the purchasing policies. So Marley, I saw shared a couple more thoughts in the chat. Thank you for that. Quick closing question to you all. I'll just say thank you. I'll express my gratitude to you all as we transition into this closing question. Your thoughtfulness has been inspiring, has been thought-provoking. I have a number more comments and questions that I started here with, which is a sign of a good conversation. I just wanted to ask you all, knowing here on this call that we have several members of both our national and global and local, hyperlocal communities, how can folks here support you in your respective work? How can folks activate on this call? And I don't want to cap you, but I do have to cap you all in the interest of time. So if you can spend no more than 20 or 30 seconds on this response, that'd be great.
I'll say very quickly that as a procurement staff here, we're always looking for potential new vendors to participate in our procurement process. So if any of you out there knows of a vendor, or if you are a vendor that will be interested in doing business with the city, feel free to reach out to me. Specifically, if you are an MWB vendor, where we're happy to work with you to walk you through the complicated procurement system process here at the city.
You heard that, everyone. That's a great call to action. Anyone else want to follow up?
I'll share, it was referenced in my conversation, but we're going to be launching this procurement guide and resource in the next few weeks. And I'm hoping it'll be an invitation for many more conversations for folks that are working along the supply chain to move forward values-based procurement. So please reach out to me if you want to make sure that you receive it when it launches. I can make sure my email is in the chat for everybody. But yeah, I look forward to staying in touch.
Thanks so much, Rachel. Everyone, check out the chat for Rachel's contact information for you to keep in touch. And just to be clear too, can they also sign up for your listserv at Common Market and get more information there too? All right, so 2 points of entry. All right, Dakari, I see you going off mute.
Yeah, well, just quickly, one, just continue to follow some of the work that we've been doing here with Chicago Food Policy Action Council. We're really proud of the updates from the Gfpi task forces, period. But then also looking at productive landscapes work, which is really essential. Stay in tune with some of our developments with the resource guide. Also just following the Food Equity Council, looking at advocates for urban agriculture. They've been doing some beautiful work for emerging food businesses. They've done some amazing work around water permitting here in Chicago. So also Hill Food Alliance, Urban Growers Collective, Grow Greater Inglewood. These are all the organizations that we work with that's been doing amazing, beautiful work here within the city. If you're in a position of looking for how do we do a focus group or something like that, consider looking at your budget and saying, do we have enough funds to stipend folks out, and also hiring people from these communities in leadership positions into your organizations. I'll leave with that. That's how we could support not only us here in Chicago, but just nationally. How can we support the development of a more equitable food system?
These are all action oriented. I hope everyone's listening and taking notes. And I saw too that Marley followed up as Dakari was speaking, mentioning that they're hiring a Chicago GFPP or Good Food Purchasing Program specialist. So she asked that you all spread the word as they build capacity over there in Chicago. And I just want to express my gratitude again. I appreciate you all, appreciate how you approach this work with the thoughtfulness that you do, with the commitment that you do. And I'm grateful that we were all able to be in discussion, sharing best practices across our regions, across our country is really important for us to build off of each other and to amplify each other and to build out these partnerships. I just want to share with the audience the IT team at the Cuny School of Public Health will be posting this recording on their YouTube channel. It'll also be emailed to all forum registrants. It usually takes about 1 to 2 business days. So if you only caught part of this, then you can catch the full recording in the very near future. And you'll see a comment there from Rosita sharing a little bit more information. So thank you all, and thank you all for spending an extra 10 minutes this morning. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, Ripka, and thank you all the panelists and the audience.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank
Take
you.
care.